Right, so if we look at that situation and fossil fuels are doing this, the fossil fuel industry have a lot of assets globally.
Yeah, they do, yes.
How do you deal with that? I mean, how much money have they got? I believe it's 4 trillion in proven reserves in the top 100 companies, fossil fuel companies in the world. That's a massive amount of money. How are we going to get them to realize that they have to change, they have to stop taking this out of the ground?
I think it works two ways. Firstly, the reason they take it out of the ground is because we buy it, and then we use it in our cars, our aircraft, and our ships. So we're using fossil fuels all the time. So if we could reduce our demand for fossil fuels, that reduces their incentive to get it out of the ground. Also, if we start to actively make a shift to other lower carbon sources of energy, renewables, nuclear, whatever that might look like, then again that removes some of our demand from fossil fuels. But at the moment, the demand for fossil fuels is going up every single year. And what is already concerning is the existing reserves that are there are enough to fry the planet effectively. And what the companies are still doing is they're looking for additional fossil fuels. They're looking underneath Shell and BP and many of the oil companies are now looking to drill underneath the Arctic. Because the Arctic is melting because of climate change, they're looking to drill underneath the Arctic to get more hydrocarbons out. So there's a real irony in that. And the only reason they can access those additional hydrocarbons is because of climate change, because of the shrinking of the Arctic. So the oil companies are still seeking out other fossil fuels. That has to be stopped. The tar sands in Canada, I mean, it's the dirtiest fuel you could imagine, and yet we're proceeding to get the oil out of the tar sands in Canada, which is an area of really very beautiful wilderness we shouldn't be touching, regardless of whether there's a reserve there or not. So at the moment, what we have is a world that is awash with fossil fuels. We're not short of fossil fuels. What we're short of is the sort of the courage, the capacity, the ingenuity to move our society away from fossil fuels to alternative sources of energy, and also to reduce the amount of energy we actually consume.
And if you take the situation, we've accumulated how much CO2 in the atmosphere so far, and how much have we left that we can afford to burn if we are to seriously hold to 2 degrees? How low is that carbon budget?
Well, the remaining carbon budget is very small indeed, and it's dwindling every single day that we fail to do anything about climate change. And the question then for those of us in the wealthy parts of the world is often say, do we think that the poorer parts of the world should have some greater access to that limited carbon budget that's available? In other words, they should be able to burn fossil fuels for a little bit longer than we can. And most of us would say that's only fair and proper, because we know that burning fossil fuels to produce their energy will in the short term increase their welfare and their well-being and their quality of life. So in the poorer parts of the world, I think it's only fair that they're allowed and encouraged to use more energy. Now let's make it as efficient as possible, and let's try and move them away from fossil fuels. But in the very short term, in the next 10 years, their energy consumption will go up, and that will improve their welfare, and that is a good thing, so their emissions will rise. That means those of us in the wealthy parts of the world have to compensate for that. And for us then, the carbon budget that remains in countries like the UK, Ireland, the whole of the EU, US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, we have an incredibly small carbon budget. For even a sort of middle to outside chance of 2 degrees C, we're talking about virtually moving across to zero carbon, very low carbon by about 2030, 2040, at the very outside 2040. Really, we should be 90-95% carbon free by about 2030. And if we were honest about that, we knew that 10 years ago. But we've just sat down and done nothing about climate change, nothing about our carbon emissions. Every single year, our emissions go up. And in fact, the rate of growth of emissions has gone up this century so far compared to the previous century.
And for that to happen, for us to meet those targets that you say, and get to zero carbon by, say, 2030, 2035, in that order, what sort of reductions do we have to make in the developed world, year on year?
Well, we'd have to make approximately, this is some of the work we've been doing here in the Tyndall Centre at University of Manchester and also University of East Anglia, about 10% per annum reductions in our energy consumption every single year. Now, the reason we say to reduce our energy consumption is because you cannot build the low carbon supply, the wind turbines, the tidal Ballard schemes, the nuclear power systems, the biofuel systems, if we can make sure that they're sustainable. We can't build those fast enough to replace the fossil fuels that we're burning. They'll take us 20 to 30 years to really get a significant amount of those built. So in the interim, what we have to do is reduce our energy consumption, because by reducing our energy consumption, we reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's released to the atmosphere, because we reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we burn. And that's where we come up with this figure of about 10% every single year for the wealthy parts of the world. But there's an equity dimension here within our own countries that probably 40, 50, 60% of the emissions in Ireland, in the UK, come from a very relatively small, maybe 5% of the population. So a small proportion of the population are responsible for the lion's share of the emissions. So even with our own country, what we're really saying is those of us that emit a lot, and we know who they are by and large, they're the relatively wealthy ones like myself, who emit well above the average, that we have to make the lion's share of the reductions in our own country. So even here in the UK or in Ireland, there will be people who are already suffering fuel poverty. Their emissions in the short term, again, should go up. But that means for those of us that emit a lot, we have to bring our emissions down even faster. The equity dimension across the north and south hemispheres, parts of the world, is hugely important. But the equity dimension in their own countries is also very important indeed. So we have to be very careful in responding to climate change, that we don't make the situation much worse for the poorer people who have not only not caused the problem, but are also going to be much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.